Hello and welcome to SiGMA Roadshow Manila edition. In our panel today, we'll be taking a look at what's beyond the pandemic. We're going to go way past till the end of the decade, discussing Asia gaming in 2030, where we'll be covering key Asian jurisdictions. We're joined today by two experts in gaming. First up, we have Vitaly Umansky, who's calling from Hong Kong. He's a senior analyst at Bernstein Research covering global gaming. He has prior experience as CFO in Studio City in Macau. And of course, we have Alidad Tash, who is joining us from Macau. He is the managing director of 28 Limited. He has held senior level positions with gaming companies in Las Vegas and Macau. So welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Yanni. How are you?
Hi,
I'm
Andy.
very good, thank you. How are you guys?
Great.
Good.
All right, so let's discuss the Asian gaming landscape in the year 2030, far enough to not be affected with today's environment, but not too far as to be too remote. So Alidad, could you please set up key underlying assumptions you and Vitaly would be basing your projections on?
Yeah, Vitaly and I discussed this when we saw the topic 2030 in Asia. So we kind of, it actually made life a lot easier because we don't have to talk about the pandemic. Obviously, by 2030, the pandemic would be hopefully a distant memory. So its effect, whether it's next year, the following year, is not going to be a matter that's of any issue. We're also assuming that within the multiple jurisdictions in Asia, there will not be any political changes or any changes in appetite as far as the government and gaming. So suddenly the government of Korea is not going to go against gaming or anything else. And we also further assume that as it is now, contrary to the rumor that pops up every once in a while, Macau will be the only place where gaming is allowed in China. In other words, if China suddenly allows gaming in Hainan or other jurisdictions, it will totally upset everything else. But as it stands right now, we're of the belief, along with most other people, that China will keep Macau and have its monopoly going for the next few years.
All right, thank you, Alidad. Now let's go through the gaming jurisdictions one by one. Vitaly, what's your take on Macau?
Sure. So, I've always been a big believer that Macau is a build it and they will come story. So as long as Macau continues to develop new integrated resorts, new features, as long as the border remains open, I think the growth prospects in Macau on the mass side of the business look exceptionally strong. We're forecasting that the Macau market should be able to grow on the mass side somewhere around kind of high single digits, 10+% year over year, kind of beginning in 2022, once we get through the pandemic. And I think that's sustainable as long as we do have some supply expansion. I think we do have that evidence in some of the new projects that will be coming online for the next couple of years. The key question is, once we get beyond 2024, 2025, will we still have new developments coming online in Macau? I think the answer is yes, and I think that leads to pretty robust growth dynamics in the mass market for all of Macau.
And what about VIP?
So VIP is a completely different animal. We've seen a significant crackdown by the Chinese authorities on effectively junket-related business within mainland China. We do not believe that business comes back in any shape or form the way it had been in the past. We go back to 2013, 2014, VIP was generating roughly $33 billion of US dollars of GGR. Those numbers came crashing down during the anti-corruption campaign, saw a little bit of recovery in 17 and 18, and then started trending down again in 19. While we don't think VIP disappears completely, we do think that junket industry will remain under significant pressure and will not revert back to even 2019 levels. We'll be lucky if we get back to kind of 2015, 2016 levels. But in the end, it doesn't really matter for Macau. We think that the profitability aspects of mass and then the coming non-gaming will be so much stronger than VIP, and that's been the case already, that VIP just becomes less and less important over time.
And Alidad, what do you think about Macau?
Vitaly and I talk so much about Macau. We have very similar thinking. There's a couple of points I want to make here. I agree with them that mass is going to be the key driver going forward, but I doubt whether or not there will be additional supply given. We know that multiple of the 6 gaming companies, there'll be a brand new addition to Cotai within the next few months. There'll be phase 2s at Wynn, at Studio City, at MGM. There will be phase 3 and 4 at Galaxy. But once these projects run out, I'm not quite certain whether or not the government's going to figure out a location within Macau to equitably allocate enough of a land to these individual 6 gaming companies to go ahead and do this, or perhaps bring a 7th one. So I think Vitaly's double-digit growth or low double digits growth for the next 4 or 5 years is very reasonable. What remains to be seen is what happens afterwards. As far as VIP, I've been pretty negative on VIP for quite some time. I think 2019 is $14 billion in gaming revenue, which is half what it was back in the 13, 14. That was something we're not going to see for quite some time. I think VIP, even when it recovers fully, I think it will be something around half as much, maybe 7 to 10 billion, if they're lucky. The shift will definitely be into mass gaming, which includes premium mass, it includes grind mass, and it will also include a lot more emphasis on the non-gaming element, which is what the government has been harping on for quite some time.
And just to add one thing, VIP, I think one of the key questions around VIP is not really what VIP will wind up being, because nobody really knows. It doesn't. We don't really know what it's going to be. We know that the economics for the casino industry of the VIP segment, junket segment, are fairly weak to begin with in terms of profitability. The question, I think, is how many of those VIP players eventually wind up coming back to Macau as premium players, mass players, premium direct players, where margins are better, where casinos have direct interface with the customer. And while the dollar amount may be lower from each of those players than it was with a junket system, the profitability may well be as good, if not better, in terms of dollars of EBITDA per visit. So I think that's what we'll see, I think, happening over time as the junket system continues to be disintermediated and exposed to significant pressure from regulators and law enforcement officials in China itself.
But that is one of the challenges with the junket world, in that they actually act as ways to bring some money on board, even for the premium mass. So from a player standpoint, whether he plays in a junket or premium mass, okay, we can argue that back and forth whether or not there's some transferability. But if junkets get severely weakened when it comes to the ability to bring money on board, how would that premium mass guy, the suddenly new premium mass guy, be able to bring in a few $1 million? And that's actually one of the challenges we're going to have on the VIP. But the other thing that I guess everybody's talking about is what's happening with the licenses. That's, I think, the government's going to emphasize even more non-gaming, whether or not that's fair or not. And I think that's going to be a challenge. If they use that 50% number yet again, which is what Las Vegas creates, 6 billion in gaming revenue, 6 billion in non-gaming revenue, there's just no way in the world Macau's 36 billion revenue and hopefully 40 and 45 billion will ever be anything close to it in the non-gaming world. And even with the addition of the additional hotel rooms and restaurants and everything else that's going to come online, it will be a tiny fraction of the gaming, despite what the government wants and even the operators are dying to produce. It just is not going to go and generate much.
All right, so we've touched upon the junkets, VIP, mass gaming. How about non-gaming?
Yeah, so Vitaly, anything to add?
Yeah, so you talked about it. I think that's actually the right assessment. I think non-gaming will over time get slightly bigger. Again, especially if we add more projects, that's the case. But if you think about Las Vegas and Macau, the comparison, it's just a flawed comparison. And I know a lot of people like to make it, as well as I do, right? I mean, if you look at the United States, the Las Vegas Strip represents 8% of gaming revenues in the United States, right? The difference is so stark. Macau is a funnel for gaming demand coming out of Greater China. Las Vegas is a destination that people go to be entertained, to go to convention, and some hardcore casino customers. But most casino customers can gamble at home. They can gamble in the casino that's 20 miles away from their house. They don't need to go to Vegas particularly to gamble. Macau is a very different animal. So that's a key difference. The second difference is that Las Vegas has over 150,000 hotel rooms. 20% of its visitation is really driven by convention business. Without having that type of critical mass, that type of scale, you just can't have the non-gaming revenues of sufficient size, right? Las Vegas gets 60 million overnight visitors a year. Once you get those numbers, if you could even do it in Macau, and I don't think the physical plant allows it, you can start getting more reasonable non-gaming numbers. But without that development, it's going to be extraordinarily hard. So you have the very large gaming revenue per visitor, and you have the non-gaming space, which is still relatively small, and the numbers of people are still relatively small. Non-gaming becomes difficult. But I do think non-gaming is critically important for driving mass business, especially grind mass, base mass business, because people need something to do, especially if you want more overnight visitors. You can't just have them gambling for 8 hours a day. That's not realistic. So you need more retail. You definitely need hotel rooms for them to stay in. You're going to need some forms of entertainment. I don't think it's going to be 3-hour shows like we have in Las Vegas, but there'll be other things for people to do. And I think that's the future that we're going to see in Macau.
All right, Alidad, let's have you take the first crack at Japan. What are your projections for Japan at the beginning of the next decade?
I hope that my projections for Japan are not going to be different than the one last decade, because everybody thought Tokyo Olympics would happen in 2020, and the casino in Tokyo would have already arrived, delivered sometimes in 19 and 20. But Japan has actually surprisingly made significant moves over the last few months after the hurry up and wait. We're in one of those hurry up modes. And I think within the next few years, Japan will finally allow the 3 casinos to come online. Whether it's going to be 2 or 3, at least 2 will come online by the end of the year, by the end of this decade. And I believe that I'm a big bull on Japan, and I think it will be quite spectacular. As long as they choose 1, perhaps 2 major metropolitan areas like Osaka and Tokyo, Osaka and Yokohama, I think Japan will be something. This will be the next wave, and it will actually force all the other jurisdictions, Singapore, Macau, Korea, to take notice and up their game, because I think it will just be very, very much advanced technologically. And revenue-wise, I think I've always been very much pro-Japan, so I think we'll do quite well.
All right, thank you. And Vitaly, what do you forecast for Japan?
Look, I think, there's a lot of question marks around Japan in terms of its regulatory regime and what the GGR outcome is going to be. A lot is really going to depend on what winds up getting built, right? If we have one property in Osaka and a property in Nagasaki, that's a very different market than if we have a $10 billion property in Osaka and a $10 billion property in Yokohama. So the numbers are going to be quite different. I think if you're building something of scale, like a Marina Bay Sands type property in Osaka or in Yokohama, you will deliver revenue numbers that are probably going to be a little bit better than Marina Bay Sands does, right? But in the end, you're only building 3 large-scale properties, maybe 2. You have severe restrictions on locals. You have the question mark around the Chinese gambler being able to gamble overseas in sufficient dollar amounts. We don't know what that's going to look like come 2026, 2027, when these properties are up and running. If there's an ease and an ability to just come from China into Japan with large wallets and gamble, that would be helpful. If there isn't, then it's going to be a much smaller market than I think people are assuming. The other thing, in my perspective, is everyone focuses on this Pachinko industry and how large it is. And my perspective on this is that the Pachinko industry, while it's indicative of gambling behavior for a certain subset of people, these are not necessarily the people that are going to be coming to the casinos. They're playing very different games, different dollar amounts. There's no entry levels of Pachinko. So I think this market will be good. It really depends on what winds up getting built and what the regulatory regime winds up looking like, both in Japan and in China. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. My biggest concern on Japan is what profitability is going to look like, not necessarily what the top line looks like.
And what do you forecast for Manila and the Philippines overall? Vitaly, could you start with this one?
Yeah, so I think the Philippines may be getting a little bit saturated. We have a lot of projects in development. We have Cebu, we have another property in Manila. Again, a lot is going to depend on the Chinese regulatory regime around whether mainland Chinese customers will be able to come and play overseas. Right now, the direction that the Chinese government is headed, pretty draconian, very difficult to do. If this stays in place, places like Manila and other ASEAN and other Asian jurisdictions will suffer the consequences. But I think the Philippines has one advantage versus some of the other markets around Asia, which is I think it has a fairly robust local market. And as long as the Philippines economy continues to grow, and hopefully it'll come out of this pandemic at some point soon and kind of revert back to being a strong growth economy, I think the growing middle class, I think, will help dramatically with that market. But I do have concerns around saturation and how many properties will be opening up over the next couple of years, assuming they all get built.
All right, and Alidad, what do you have to say in response to that?
I think Vitaly is correct about the locals market. It has a very healthy locals market in Manila. I think that right now the entertainment city contains 3 properties. Having the additional 2 come online within the next few years is actually a plus, and it may assist what Vitaly earlier mentioned or referred to, which is whether or not China is going to be very pro or anti sending its players to overseas. That is something that has yet to be clarified. We are not quite sure what this blacklist that China has hinted at, whether or not it contains the current existing casinos. Is Manila one of them? Is Cambodia one of them? Is Japan going to be one of them? That is some kind of a gray area that has to be clarified. But the good news is, I think that those 2 additional ones will, the additional properties coming online in entertainment city, these are going to be pretty big properties. I think they're going to have a cluster effect in entertainment city, and that's going to make it a little bit more attractive. So I think Manila will continue to vie for in a pretty good spot in Asia in terms of ranking.
All right, and Alidad, would you like to kick off with Korea? What do you forecast about Korea?
Korea is a challenge. There's a couple of, one of them opened up a couple months ago. Dream Tower opened. The license will open relatively soon in Jeju. I think it's going to have some challenges just because it's located in Jeju, which is difficult to get to. There's a couple of properties that are going to be built in Incheon, which is very close to Seoul, right next to the airport. Whether or not they're going to be successful, they're handicapped because the government of Korea, with the exception of one remote area, is not allowing local gaming. And exactly the opposite of Philippines, which the local gaming will help it sustain itself. Not having local gaming is going to be pretty challenging. With Japan coming, opening up gorgeous properties, it would just be such a simple hop on a plane and go and be in Japan gambling. I think it's going to take some time before the Korean government is going to recognize, hey, this just cannot happen. Let's tax it at least. So instead of these people losing their shirt in Japan, at least we'll be able to get some of the money back in terms of taxes. So I don't see very good news for individual IRs will do good, but collectively the overall market's not going to do that much better.
All right, and Vitaly, I'd love to hear what you have to add to that.
Yeah, look, I think Korea is a disaster. I think the government doesn't really know what they want to do. They've been very clear that locals is a non-starter outside of the local casino they have. If that mentality doesn't change, I think these large-scale integrated resorts that are being built now are going to be disasters waiting to happen in terms of profitability and return on investment. These types of assets cannot survive dependent on foreign gamblers, irrespective of what foreign nations do with allowing or not allowing their customers to come. Even if China allowed all their customers to go and gamble and junkets can go and do whatever you want, you're not going to be able to make the returns in large-scale, multi-billion-dollar casinos that are just geared towards foreign gamblers. It's just not going to work. Even when you think about Singapore, which I think maybe we'll get to, but Singapore has a very large, robust local market. And without that market, the return on investment there would be awful. So you need to have the local environment. Macau does so well for the sole reason that it has Guangdong and Hong Kong right next to it. That's the local market. Without it, Macau would be a very different animal. And every time governments look around and say, we're going to rely on foreigners and we're going to require multi-billion-dollar developments, it just never works.
I think one more thing to add in Korea is that the size of the infrastructure, I mean, how are you going to compete with a up to $10 billion property in Tokyo or in Osaka? It's just very difficult for someone to want to risk their neck and go and gather this stuff and make it spectacular and just rely on foreigners. I just think that's one of the challenges that Korea is going to face.
All right, interesting perspectives about Korea. Now, we move on to Singapore. The country has only issued 2 gambling licenses, with both properties operating since 2010. Do any of you foresee any changes with regards to this? Vitaly, could you start with you?
Sure. Look, I like the Singapore market. It's low growth, right? It's been low growth for a while. The properties, especially Marina Bay Sands, are capacity constrained. Marina Bay Sands prior to the pandemic was running at 99% occupancy for its 20 rooms at very, very high ADRs. And they need more capacity. And I think by getting more capacity, they'll be able to incrementally drive revenues, both non-gaming and gaming, in that property. And I think Genting will be able to do the same thing, maybe not execute as well as Marina Bay Sands, in my view, but they'll be able to grow the market because Singapore in itself is a destination. And with the expansion that both Genting and Sands are planning for Singapore, by the time we get to 2025, 2026, these properties will be larger. There'll be new, fresh properties, features. Singapore, as I said, is a destination market, not just for Southeast Asia, but for Greater Asia and further into the Middle East, et cetera. So I think Singapore remains a critical market. And the fact that they do have a duopoly, it's a protected market. They don't have to worry as much about new competition coming online versus a market like Philippines, for example, which is a free-for-all. So I think that market will grow, but I think it needs the capacity expansion, which both operators are going to be putting in.
And Alidad, what's your take on Singapore?
I think Vitaly is correct. There will be low growth. Singapore since 2010 has been wonderfully boring and predictable, which is what the government has always wanted. I think once the new supply and the new hotels and restaurants and malls and everything else that's going to be added over the next few years for both properties are going to be built, there'll be a nice little uptick in volume, and then it will go back to the 99% occupancy, and they'll be predictably doing better than they currently are, and they will continue doing so over the long run.
All right, and how about Vietnam? Vitaly, would you like to start?
Sure. Look, Vietnam has been something that I think many operators have looked at in terms of trying to penetrate that market or enter the market for well over a decade. I remember back in New Cotai, we were looking at building a large-scale property in Da Nang. We were looking at doing something up in the north part of the country. We never pulled the trigger, largely because the regulatory environment just never worked for us. Obviously, there's been some newer developments in Vietnam, but the problem you have in Vietnam, the continued problem you have in Vietnam, is that the government, I think, has very unrealistic expectations around what needs to get built versus what they're putting on the table in terms of regulatory environment. So, you look at properties that have been built, whether it's Ho Tram, whether it's Hoi An, which is kind of partially opened up, they're going to have significant problems without having a local market. Again, it goes back to the same issue that we discussed around Korea, which is without a local market, a multi-billion-dollar integrated resort doesn't work, right? You can get away with a $100 million property or $150 million property if you can target foreigners, and it's easy to get there. And the tax situation looks good and the regulatory environment is loose, then it works. But if you don't have those things and you have a multi-billion-dollar property without a local market, there's no way it works. So I don't know what's going to happen in Vietnam. I'm not very optimistic that the government is going to change its regulatory environment in such a way that it allows large-scale, highly qualified operators and developers to come in and do what they're doing. And I think Hoi An is going to be a bit of a test on kind of what winds up happening.
Okay, point taken. How about Alidad?
I think geographically, Hoi An is suffering from the fact that Macau in the north and Singapore in the south is going to take care of everything that's going to happen in Southeast Asia. And also with the crackdown on VIP, there's just going to be very few people from China willing to go all the way down to Vietnam to get an experience that's not even the real Macau. So I think it's going to have they're going to have challenges like Vitaly said.
Yeah, and just one thing to add, I forgot to mention this. I'm not a believer at all that beach casinos work, right? They haven't worked anywhere. I mean, Atlantis in the Bahamas, you can argue maybe, but even that is mostly non-gaming. People don't go to beach resorts, 5-star luxury beach resorts, and then want to sit in a baccarat table for 8 hours gambling. That's not why they're going to those types of locations. So any customer that actually wants that experience doesn't need to go to a beach resort. They can go to a Four Seasons, they can go to Ritz-Carlton, they can go to Mon Resorts. They don't need to go to a casino resort that's kind of located in maybe not the best location. in order to have that. If they want to gamble, they'll go to a gambling property. If they want a resort vacation holiday, that's where they'll go. And I think the two just have never worked well together.
Agree.
And could the both of you give your projections for Cambodia and Thailand? What do you forecast about these jurisdictions?
Cambodia is going to be, with Sihanoukville and the departure on the anti-VIP and online gambling crackdown, I think it's going to be a very big challenge in Cambodia as far as any new players in the market. As far as Thailand, however, that's been the fantasy location, probably the most talked about jurisdiction that has yet to have casino after Japan. And a lot of places, and this is the environment where it is much more likely now than 10 years ago with the former king to potentially have gaming. If an integrated resort does work in Thailand, I think the combination of hospitality, beauty, food, the familiarity of everybody else with Thai and culture, I think it will be a fantastic addition to Asian gaming. It will offer something new. But I don't think Myanmar and Vietnam and Malaysia or all these other locations are going to be anything that are going to be matched by Singapore and Macau as far as the south part of Asia is concerned.
And Vitaly, anything you'd like to add?
No, just like Cambodia, I think Naga, with the monopoly position it has in Phnom Penh, I think will continue to do well. I think one of the questions is around, again, going back to China and whether they'll allow people to come and gamble. If that kind of remains in force, and there is kind of a good relationship between China and Cambodia from a government to government perspective, so that may happen. Naga, I think, is well positioned with a very low tax rate, with a decent local business. So I think that that should continue to do okay. Thailand, it's a question mark. There's obviously no gaming there now. If Thailand decides to go down the path of, Vietnam or Korea, then it's going to be a disaster, right? They're just not going to be able to do the right thing. If they go for full-fledged gambling with locals, that market could be very, very interesting, and it'll actually hurt, I think, if that were to happen, it would actually hurt markets like Cambodia and like Vietnam, where you do have players coming into those areas from Thailand. But that would be the impact. But I agree. I think whatever they build, it's not going to match up with Singapore and Macau, and those are going to be the two dominant animals until Japan comes online, which will then join kind of that triumvirate.
All right, thank you very much. Now we're down to our final question, gentlemen. What about online gaming by the end of this decade? What are your thoughts? Vitaly, would you like to start?
Yeah, I guess online gaming with the pandemic is getting a lot more interest. Obviously, there's many out there that are arguing you have to have online gaming because that's the future. I don't think many of the governments around Asia are willing to allow legalized online gaming for its own people. I think people are happy having, set up online gaming, get the revenues from other countries, which is kind of what Philippines does, although they have started a little bit with locals. That model just is not going to work in the long run. So I think China, I don't think goes down the path of legalizing online. Neither does Korea, neither does Japan. Your big markets are not going to do it, I don't think, anytime in the foreseeable future. So consequently, I think it's going to be largely a discussion topic. People are talking about, well, Macau should legalize online gaming. I don't know who the customer is because China is not going to allow it. So I think in the end, it's a lot of talk and really not much is going to happen on that front.
And Alidad, yes?
Not much to add. I agree. I think China has no appetite for online gaming for the long run, and that's the 800-pound gorilla. Without China, nothing's going to happen.
And so, in your opinion, how would you rank the markets by the end of the decade? Alidad, let's start with you.
Gaming markets, in terms of gaming revenue, if that's what you mean, had there not been a pandemic, by now we would have had, and I'm talking about, let's talk about markets. I'm not talking about US as a single market because it's so huge. We're talking about Las Vegas, perhaps, Macau, something geographically contained. Macau is number one, Las Vegas, Manila Entertainment City, and Singapore would have been vying for number two. By the end of the decade, with some of the changes and everything that's going to happen over the next few years kind of having been resolved, I think the Macau will retain its position. It's so far ahead of everybody else that unless something disastrous happens, like China completely makes it illegal to gamble, which is not likely, Macau will be number one. I think Philippines, I think Manila, an entertainment city with its 5 integrated resorts, will be a solid number 2. When it comes to Japan, we're not counting Japan as one market, but we're counting individual locations. It is very possible that in Osaka or Tokyo or Yokohama by itself will be as large as an entertainment city. But that's going to be a things having to be very, very rosy, because by the end of the decade, things would not have had enough time to mature. But I think entertainment city would be number 2, followed closely by one of the larger Japan cities, Singapore, and perhaps Las Vegas worldwide.
And Vitaly, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it's about I think that's probably about right. I think the key question is just on Japan and what they wind up doing, and how big entertainment city, kind of, if that's one location, can actually become. I think there's going to be more cannibalization in the entertainment city than Alidad does. But I think in the end, that's probably what it looks like. And I think Singapore, depending on how strong this expansion is going to be in terms of how much business it drives in, that could put Singapore over the top above entertainment city. But I think Macau by far is going to be the number 1 GGR destination in the world, with no clear second, nowhere remotely close to them.
Fantastic. Sounds like the future looks bright for Asia indeed. Well, thank you, Alidad and Vitaly. Indeed, the both of you have put together interesting, thought-provoking predictions about the gaming industry that in the 8 markets that we have covered today. So thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us this afternoon and for this riveting discussion.
Thank you very much, Yanni. Take care, Vitaly.
Thanks, Yanni. Good seeing you.